Math 2, Unit 3, Fall Final Review. So I decided to make a video for each of the units that we've already covered. So what that means is that I already have videos for 3.1 and 3.2 and 3.3a and 3b and 3c and 3d and 3e and 3.3 and 3.4 and 3.5 and 3.6. Those videos are all on my website if you need more information about any specific topic you want. There is a 20-minute video, 15-minute video that goes into each section. So like if you look at however many sections this is, I think it's like either 11 or 12, multiply that by 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and that's how much content I actually have online for you if you need it. That's only if you need it. So what I decided to do is, now that we're at the end of the semester, let's look back at Unit 3 and let's see if we can summarize things so that as you're getting ready to do your final or as you're preparing for it, let's review what we're supposed to know. What were the big ideas when we got done with Unit 3? What was Unit 3 about? It was about congruent figures. You learned that when something was congruent, that all their angles were congruent and all their sides were congruent. That's what makes something congruent to another. And really, our whole chapter was primarily about proving triangles congruent to each other. Matter of fact, our second section was the section that we spent the most time in, or the most amount of problems had answers that came from these 5 things. The main idea of almost all of chapter 3 was, did you know the 5 shortcuts? Did you know the 5 shortcuts that could prove one triangle congruent to another? They were SSS, SAS, ASA, AAS, and HL. Now, if we learned those 5 shortcuts, those could prove that one triangle was the same as another. Now, I didn't like the examples that they gave us over there because most of the examples were 2 triangles that shared something, that crossed or intersected, and we had to be able to do things to the 2 triangles because they shared something in common. So even with these examples that I picked here a long time ago, I would have to use something to be able to know whether it was going to be one of these 5. So let me remind you, these 5 things are the most important. If you need more details about it, maybe you need to go back to the 3.2 video. But you could only add things to your picture when there was a shared side. That was called the reflexive property. A shared angle, that's also the reflexive property. Or vertical angles, that's where there are 2 lines that intersect across each other. And or parallel line postulates like alternate interior angles or corresponding angles. Alternate interior angles make that Z shape. If those are parallel, the alternate interior angles would be this one and that one. The corresponding make the F shape. Sometimes the F is on its back. If these are parallel, it would be these 2 angles are congruent to each other. Congruent, congruent. So as you are trying to decide which one is which, if something had something shared, like this triangle and the top triangle and the bottom triangle share this diagonal, that is congruent to each other by the reflexive property. You could add that to your picture. That's why this one's HL. These vertical angles are congruent to each other. But there is no such thing as a side-side angle, so we would say that there's not enough information for that one. We have an angle, parallel line postulates. I see some corresponding angles. I'm thinking this one's angle-side angle. So that was really the main idea of chapter 3, was because once you learn those 5 postulates, then we introduce something called a proof. And the proofs were these things where you had to actually take some pieces of given information and then prove those triangles are congruent. Well, if you never understood this the first time, let's talk about it again. It's one of those 5 reasons. There's going to be one of those 5 reasons why one triangle is congruent to the next, but we have to build. We have to start with a side and another side. We have to know what the side and what other side it's congruent to, and with this side, and then be able to say, hey, I know that one's shared. I know that that's the same in both because of the reflexive property. And the reason why this triangle will be congruent to the other triangle is because of something called SSS. Proofs were all about proving the triangle's congruent using something from section 2. If you know your 5 shortcuts, we added something called the reflexive property. We added something called the vertical angles are congruent reason, that this angle is going to be the same as that angle. And we can prove it using one of our 5 postulates. That's the big idea. We threw in a couple other words, bisectors. There were angle bisectors and segment bisectors. If you figured out what an angle bisector or a segment bisector is, you could use it to prove that 2 pieces were congruent. That would help you choosing which one you were using. You can also use the definition. Anytime you use the definition, by the way, you're using the word's definition. It has to be somewhere in your given, like the word bisects. We can then use the definition of what kind of bisector was that. It's something that's bisecting an angle. That's an angle bisector. We're using the definition of an angle bisector. We even use the alternate interiors and corresponding. There's the Z and the F again. We even used perpendiculars for HL when we were working on that. And the whole reason we learned all of that information was so that we could prove that one triangle was congruent. Like, all of this was all about proving triangles congruent to each other. And then we got to section 4 and we learned a new postulate or theorem called CPC-TC. And what that represented was each letter represented a word, and it says corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. It was the reason that we could prove 2 triangles that were congruent to each other and then use their parts to prove, then we would know that their parts were also the same as each other. So for example, if I had a proof and I was proving this is congruent to that, once I prove that the triangles were congruent, then I can use their parts to prove that those angles are the same. That would be a CPCTC at the end of my proof. There were only 2 other very, very, very small ideas. Isosceles and equilateral triangles. This wasn't the main idea, but we threw in some problems. Oh, there may be one. There may be 2. I don't even think there'll be 2. There may be one on isosceles or an equilateral triangle. And what did we have to know? Isosceles triangles, if 2 sides were the same, then 2 angles were going to be the same, the ones across from each other. And same backwards is true, which is if 2 angles are the same, then 2 sides are the same. And equilateral was 3 angles and 3 sides are going to be the same. Not a main idea. And transformations were not necessarily a main idea. They were just saying, if you know they're congruent, then when you do these rigid motions, they would also be congruent. That's why they threw this in chapter 3. You could do a translation, a reflection, or a rotation, and they would still be congruent to each other. So like I said, proofs and those 5 shortcuts are a main idea. There are going to be several proofs on your final. Do not do not overlook, do you understand proofs? That's the reason why we had a 3.3a. Proofs using this. That's why we had a 3.3b. Proofs using that. That's why we had a 3.3c. Proofs using that. That's why we had a 3.3d. Proofs using that. 3.3e. Proofs using that. And even 3.4 were proofs as well. And then we had even overlapping triangles and stuff like that. So keep in mind, proofs are important. We will use those 5 shortcuts inside proofs, but you have to be able to understand proofs. If that's not something that you enjoy hearing, I'm sorry. Maybe you need to watch the 3.3a video again. And if you don't get it, then watch the 3.3b video, because I go much slower in those videos. But that's what Unit 3 is about. I would say that Unit 3, we probably did not balance our final out very well. That means that there are more questions from Unit 3 than other questions. I feel like your final is a little lopsided. Unit 3, proofs and these things. And then Unit 7, do you know your trig? Those are heavy on your final. 4, 5, and 6, there's some questions from there, but not as many as these ones. So you got to know it. As you're doing your problems today, give that one a go. I'm going to stop your notes right there.